Morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. If I can invite everyone out the back enjoying some breakfast to come in and take your seats, and also to invite everyone to silence their phones. We're going to get going imminently as our guests arrive on the stage. So welcome, everybody. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Vice President of Communications and Policy Outreach here at the Centre, and we're delighted to see you here this morning for what is the first of CGD's events during this busy spring meetings week. I'll tell you a little bit about the other events later on. But first of all, I want to welcome also people who are watching virtually on the live stream and via our YouTube channel. We're going to keep plenty of time for questions at the end. So that'll be questions from people in the room, but also people watching on the live stream. And the way you can contribute questions is by scrolling to the bottom and seeing the comment section. Leave your question there. We've got someone monitoring both the live stream and our YouTube channel. Please tell us who you are, your affiliation, and write your question, and if we can get to it during the audience section, we will. We're also tweeting live about this, and I encourage all of you to do the same. If you'd like to, please use our hashtag, which is on the screen, hashtag CGD Talks, and include our handle at CGDev, so we'll know to respond and acknowledge your comment as well. And that's another way that you can leave questions for our guests as well. So with that, let me say we are delighted to welcome both our guests. It's family coming home, really. Arvind Subramanian, who is the Chief Economic Adviser to the Government of India, also a CGD Senior Fellow, currently on leave because you are kind of busy at the moment. And we're especially delighted to welcome Annie Lowry, who's a contributing editor to The Atlantic, and recently wrote a long article for New York Magazine about universal basic income, New York Times Magazine, about universal basic income, which is available on the desk out there. So if you haven't read it, please take it on the way out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Annie and Arvind. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here, and to Arvind for being here. So we're here to talk about poverty and government efficacy in India. The country is home to about 1 in every 3 poor people. And a report that Arvind and his colleagues put out suggested that a UBI could bring the poverty rate down to less than a percentage point even in India. And even talking about this seems to have been made partially possible by the establishment of biometric IDs there, by a push to bank the unbanked, and by the spread of mobile phones, among other trends. So we're here to talk about all of that, as well as demonetization, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. But first, I'm going to give Arvind a few minutes to set our conversation up here.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to everyone for coming. I think I want to frame the whole UBI debate first, because I do think that there's a lot of, because it's so much being discussed all around the world, I think we risk losing sight of the fact that actually there are 3, maybe more, but at least 3 different conversations taking place on UBI. The first is in the advanced country setting, where Silicon Valley is, a kind of guilt of Silicon Valley that they might render employment completely passé, that you have this whole should work and income be coupled or decoupled. And so that's one conversation. Then until last night, I thought there were just 2 conversations that, and then there's the conversation in the low income setting. And then I reread actually Annie's piece yesterday, which was all about Kenya. And then it struck me that actually there are 2 completely different conversations happening within developing countries themselves. One is, in the kind of sub-Saharan African setting, which is pretty much kind of donor-driven. The whole Give Direct experience. There's a kind of RCT taking place, and what are the impacts? Do people benefit, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the Indian setting is completely different in 2-3 different ways. One is that this is not going to be donor-financed at all. It is going to be completely financed within. So the issues that come up relate to, do we have the fiscal space to do it? That's one. The second thing is that this is going to be a kind of macro, if it happens, and we'll get to that later. It will be a kind of scaled up version. It's not going to be, 80 villages, what is the impact, and then we think about scaling up. It will be a kind of scaled up kind of thing, which means that we have to, right from the start, think of this in macro terms, not in micro terms. So the whole RCT stuff that, the Kenya stuff is in a sense, actually I think, and I'll say something controversial here, I think it's also a bit irrelevant to the Kenyan context itself, because if you want to scale it up, the magnitudes involved, the general equilibrium effect involved are going to be so enormous and so important to take into account that whether or not it benefits, 100 villages might be a little bit, moot, as it were. And of course, the other thing that's very interesting in the Indian context is that this is something that doesn't necessarily have to be implemented, by the center, like one scheme. We have 29 different states, and then these states can do it on their, they can start on their own. Some states can do it. We can learn from that, and then it can spread. And then, of course, very interesting center state. Who's going to pay for it? Is it just going to be the states? Going to be federal transfers? So a whole bunch of things I think become very interesting. And that's I thought we should begin by recognizing that there are kind of three different settings in which this conversation is taking place.
Right, absolutely. And so I wonder if you could drill down. I agree with you that in a country like Kenya, where the money would be coming externally, and you would have basically, it would act something like a huge amount of GDP would be involved in what's fundamentally a remittance to the country.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
So, you have obvious macro questions about that. But in India, what are the macro questions that you have if this were to happen in a state or across the country? It seems to me that you still have the questions about inflation, about consumption. What else?
So I think the two or three big macro questions in India are, one, and this is what I think is something that kind of makes people a bit nervous to implement this, which is that my colleague here, Boban Paul, who worked actually did the calculations for us for the economic survey. So we calculate that it's something like 4.5 to about 4 to 5% of GDP. Now, the Indian government simply cannot afford that. So the only way this can work is potentially if we can phase down some existing programs, otherwise it doesn't work. So then you get into the political economy of, can you phase down these other, subsidies, for example, the fertilizer subsidy, the employment guarantee scheme, can you phase that down politically or not? Because if you can't phase it down, an extra 4 to 5% of GDP is not very meaningful. So that's one big kind of macro question that we have. The other big question is that, and this is part of the critique that comes, is that some people think that we do have a reasonably good, or we built up a reasonably good welfare program in terms of giving away food, subsidized food. Now, would this kind of undermine that? That's one question. And the third, I think, big macro question is, is the infrastructure to implement this, the whole biometrics, financial inclusion, and mobile, is it really at a state where you can actually implement the UBI? So these are some three big kind of macro issues that we have to deal with when discussing.
And can you address that last macro issue, right? What would it take in terms of building up infrastructure? Because it seems that even with the success of providing biometric IDs and, and promoting financial inclusion, that you still have a large number of people that this wouldn't reach at this point. And you would also face the issue of the folks who might be excluded, who might be harder to reach, being those that you would most want to target. Most poor, most
Correct.
Remote.
So just to give you some numbers, for example, in terms of the biometric thing in India now, about 1.1 billion people have biometric identification. Just to think of the scale of that number is just enormous, right? At the same time, I think something like 250 million people have these accounts, financial accounts. And about 60% of those are actually linked to the Aadhaar, the biometric thing. In terms of mobile, 250 million people have smartphones. 350 million people have regular phones, and 350 million people have no phones. So that's the state of kind of infrastructure. Because ideally what you want is that you want the biometric number to be linked to the bank account, to be linked to the mobile. That's the kind of dream. We call this the JAM infrastructure because J stands for the financial inclusion, A for the biometrics, and M for the mobile. We want all of this to come together. Now, at the moment, it's very patchy in terms of how this is developed. I think some of the states where you would think, as you quite rightly said, where many poor people live, those are the states where perhaps the last mile infrastructure is kind of not as advanced as it should be. But there are lots of places where it's getting there, and you can easily conceive of states in India where you can actually start this. Maybe not perfect, but reach a large percentage of even the poor.
Mm-hmm. And so, talk with me instead about that kind of like first question. If you had a state in India that chose, and it does seem that this is an option for many of them starting to consider this, that chose to go down this path, would it need federal resources to do so? This is a question in the United States sometimes. There's a bunch of activists in California that want to do a UBI there, but without the federal income tax, it's not going to be an easy thing to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
impossible one.
Yeah. So I think that in principle, nothing prevents the state government from doing it on its own.
Right.
They can just do it, right? They're doing loan waivers instead, of course, farm loan waivers, but that's for another conversation. So they could do it on their own. But I think what some of the states that are thinking about this seriously do want federal money for this. Now, one way that would work is that under our constitution, the center, the federal entity, transfers money to the different state governments, but often in the form of tied money, saying that we give you X amount of money, but this is tied, say, to the employment guarantee scheme. Mm-hmm. This is for the public distribution system. So one possibility is for the states to say to the center, look, don't give us more money, not asking for more money. We'll put some skin in the game, but give us this money as untied money and let us use it for, say, a UBI. And that's the kind of, I think, conversation that's beginning to happen. Mm-hmm. Because then that would make it easier for the state governments to finance this.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of work do you think it would take to implement that, though? It seems to me that there's still, UBI is a kind of theoretically elegant solution to getting money into the hands of the poorest. But as you pointed out, there's all of these frictions, right? There's overcoming the state and federal issue. There's ensuring that you have last mile and first mile solutions to make sure that the money gets out. So what would it take to actually pilot this in a way so that you could start to understand some of those macro effects that you were talking about?
Well, so I think there are some states which could just say, if we get this money from the center, mm-hmm. we can just go ahead and start doing this because this infrastructure is kind of largely in place. See, but I think I should have said this earlier. Remember, one of the starting points for this conversation in India is the fact that existing social welfare schemes like the employment guarantee scheme or the food subsidy or the kerosene subsidy or the fertilizer subsidy are very leaky, and they don't do a great job of reaching the poorest. So in some senses, if you say, well, UBI, there are last mile problems, so it's not perfect, but it has to be compared against the existing scheme, mm-hmm. where it's even less perfect in terms of reaching the poorest. So it's that relative comparison. So if we could make the case, and the states could make the case as they are, that the existing scheme actually, in fact, we have these calculations in the economic survey, which Boban did, for example, which shows how weak the targeting can be for these programs, and UBI, universal basic income, can easily improve upon that. So at least in a relative sense, it can be sold as a substantial improvement.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think that these digital technology systems like Aadhaar should be used, though, for progressive aims, for non-universal programs, right? So you have this system that seems to be better infrastructurally for moving money out. Why UBI as opposed to something else? Some form of credit that could be used to better target the poor as opposed to being universal.
You see, that's the problem. See, we start off with the fact that the attraction of UBI, in some conceptual sense, and this is the work that Martin has done as well, is that targeting has proved to be highly inefficient and ineffective, mm-hmm. right? So you want to cover everyone because that's the best way of reaching, the 40%, 50% that you want to. Now, If you want to say, no, but we have new technology, let's use that for better targeting, I think it's going to kind of run into the same issues that you get into with conventional targeting as well. So maybe there are solutions where you can improve targeting, but I think that I'll give you one example why it happens that targeting will always, I think, run into problems. That you take our employment guarantee scheme, for example. Anything that has to be accessed by the state governments, for example. You have a program, then they have to implement it in some way or the other. It turns out that the very states that are better at doing that, right, by definition are going to be the states that have the least amount of poor. I mean, if you have better governance, by definition, you have less poor in that state, and that's what we find in the employment guarantee scheme, for example, and that's true for schemes across the board. That the states that are better off and are better able to take advantage are the ones who need it the least. You take a state like Bihar, which is probably the second poorest state in India, the employment guarantee scheme virtually doesn't function there. Whereas in a state like Andhra Pradesh, where there are fewer poor, or Tamil Nadu, is where most of the money is actually taken up, even under the employment guarantee scheme. And that's always going to be there. And I think that's why universality and driven from top down. The advantage of a universal basic income is that someone from up there just sends a check to a bank account, and you kind of bypass all the intervening stages of the bureaucracy, which is where all the leakages and the corruption takes place.
Mm-hmm. So there's obviously a number of experiments ongoing, and there have been a number of experiments historically in UBI. Do you feel like any of those have had, but they've tended to be small, and many of them have tended to be in countries that wouldn't seem immediately relevant to the Indian context? I know that there was one conducted in India itself, but again, it was a very small micro study, right? Yeah. Are there things that you are looking to in thinking about how to actually structure this? Or is there research that gives you confidence, or is it more broadly coming from the research about cash transfers and efficacy?
So I think that's a great question. So as you said, the only experiment that's taking place in India on the UBI is in a state called Madhya Pradesh, where it's a very small thing. So I don't think. What I think gives us confidence is actually a scheme that our friend here implemented in India. He's actually the architect of the world's biggest cash transfer program, which is the Indian cooking gas subsidy. And Neeraj is the one who kind of conceptualized it and actually implemented it. But that, I think, the success with that. So think of it this way, right? That you have cash transfers for specific subsidies. You give kerosene subsidy, you have this, and then you have UBI. And basically, if you scale up cash transfers, it kind of approaches a UBI. So we've had success with the cooking gas subsidy, which has reached millions, hundreds of millions of people, and so that's the infrastructure that we want to build upon, which gives us confidence that we can actually overcome the last mile problem and so on. So it's not so much the Madhya Pradesh experiment as the success with the other cash transfer programs. Mind you, not all of them are going great. I think the cooking gas is doing well, but the food and the kerosene programs are not doing as well. But we know we have a successful program, and we want to build upon that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the strongest argument against UBI that you've heard from all of the response that you've gotten about this?
Yeah, I think the strongest response is, in India would be the strongest response would be, and this is what even all the politicians with whom one speaks to, they say is that, look, there are two things. One, it's going to be very difficult to phase out existing programs. The political economy of exit in India is fiendishly difficult. And that's true across the world. Very difficult to withdraw entitlements. Mm-hmm. So people basically say that you give this program, people will say thank you very much. You can't get rid of the other subsidies, so you just have an add-on. So unless you can actually phase down existing programs, because the magnitudes are so big that you can't really. So I think that's kind of the critique from one side. I think the critique from the left is that, as I said earlier, we have a public distribution system now, or a kind of a welfare net, a social safety net, which has a cooking gas subsidy, which has a food subsidy, a kerosene subsidy, that warts and all have is doing reasonably well, and there's a great threat that if you get a UBI, that gets dismantled, and then perhaps there are consequences for the poorest who benefit from the existing welfare program. So I think that's and I think the final critique is that in the kind of popular imagination, people fear that this could be a way of the government to say, we're doing this, and therefore we don't provide the public goods like health and education. So that's another concern as well from the left. So I think these are the three big concerns, I think, which we need to address.
Got it. So I'd like to move on for a moment to talk about demonetization, which seems that the rollout had some issues and that it did negatively impact GDP. Were you surprised by the scale of the impact?
I was going to say that demonetization is so yesterday that why are we talking about it?
Ages ago.
Yeah, so I think I think demonetization had a number of interesting things. We wrote about it in the survey. I've actually been firstly, I don't. There has been an impact on the informal sector, which I think it's going to be difficult to assess. We're just not going to be able to get a handle. It was in the past. I think it's pretty much over because it was related a lot to there not being cash in the economy, but now the cash has come back. So so hopefully those short-term costs are pretty much kind of behind us. But that being said, I do think that the headline numbers may not give a full sense of the actual impact of demonetization, and I think we'll get to know within over the course of the next few months what the actual impact is going to be. Because remember, there's going to be an impact on the downside, but there's also going to be an impact on the upside, which is are we going to get more digitalization as a consequence of demonetization, for example, because people have been moving into credit and digital payments. It's kind of digital payments are really taking off. Are we going to see a situation where there's going to be more tax compliance? Because in some ways, demonetization on the part of the government does signal a kind of regime shift, which basically says, guys, if you are going to be not compliant on your tax payments, the government is going to take extra effort to make sure that you do so. So it's kind of signaling a regime change. So I think a lot of these impacts of demonetization, it really is a case of too early to tell, and we'll find out over the course of the next few months. Except the impact on the informal sector, which I don't think we're going to really get a handle on at all.
Right. But do you think that there was a way that this could have been done better to ease the regressive impact? So obviously you had folks who were very negatively impacted, that are very low income, that all of a sudden had this hurdle to get over with their cash. And it seems like, on the other hand, perhaps there was less immediate tax compliance than might have been expected with folks who were bringing cash in and might have been higher income. So were you surprised by the distributional impact that this seems to have had?
See, on the tax compliance, again, it's something that we're going to find out what the impact has been. I think that a lot of this whole demonetization, it's part economics, part politics, right? And I think that there are quite different lenses and perspectives with which to view demonetization. Could it have been done better? I think that's something I'm going to leave for the historians, not for me to discuss in any great detail. But it does raise some really interesting questions about, just to kind of make it a little bit more, bring it down here. The thought crosses my mind is there an analogy between what you've seen on demonetization in terms of the popular response and the kind of thing we see here? Why is it that people vote for a party that is going to deprive it of its medical assistance. So kind of the what's wrong with Kansas kind of thing. I think there is a kind of counterpart here as well, and it's kind of what's wrong with Kansas blown up because, I mean, if you think, I'm not sure, but if you think there was a cost, then why is it that the popular reaction to this has been so overwhelming? So I think it certainly humbled me in terms of my understanding of Indian politics and Indian even economics to some extent.
And so to what extent do you think that the demonetization has changed your understanding of UBI in the conversation, right? Because it does seem broadly like it is a step in the same direction, right? Towards moving to a more digital, more accountable, perhaps a broader tax base, more tax compliance, that all of these things would be working together towards moving towards cash transfer.
Yeah, exactly. I think the demonetization, digitalization, and UBI are all heading, if that's the theme of the talk, I think they're all heading in that direction. It's really about creating an infrastructure using technology to better deliver government services in the long run. And they're all kind of, better deliver government services on the one hand, but also improve kind of, if you think of this, I mean, one way of thinking about the three themes of the title is that if you think about a social contract between, the citizen and the taxpayer and government, what you have now is that, the government says, we use technology, we use digital to better deliver government services, but you in turn, the citizen and the taxpayer, get more compliant and pay taxes, bring more people into the tax net. So I think you could think of this as a reinforcing a broader social compact between the citizens and the state, which can only kind of bode well. I mean, whether it's going to be achieved is a different question, but conceptually you could think of this as essentially, and remember, I fundamentally believe that all of development is about getting this social compact right. If you get this right, you do well politically and economically. You don't get it right, nothing really changes fundamentally. So in that sense, you could think of this as really what all governments should aim to do is to kind of reinforce that basic social compact.
Great. So at this point, I think we are going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I think we'll probably take a couple of them and then give Arvind a chance to answer. I think that there's a microphone, so just 1 second, and then we have some folks who'd like to ask a question here. Yeah, it's right here. Oh, sorry.
Thanks very much. Bill McGreevy, I used to work in the bank, and hanging around over there, I picked up a report ready for consideration by the board, a much smaller country, which was proposing a World Bank loan of $100 million just in order to get the fingerprints or the eye watch or whatever was required to make sure everybody could be counted. How will India pay for such effort?
Okay. Then there's a gentleman also in the third row that we'll just take a couple questions.
My name is Asan Karim. I am Bangladeshi American. I have two questions. Before that, I am saying that in Bangladesh, we implement first part in universal allowances in 1997. This is oldest. And second stage is child, in the name of child, education and health allowances in 1st March 2017. So it is produced by me. This concept is 1985. It is a part of my democratic economic system. My question is, I am agreed with you. I found in Bangladesh it needs 2% for oldest and of GDP and 4% for child, total 6%. I estimated it. And government, I asked the government, the head of the government, the Sheikh Hasina, they start with the minimum level. He started in 97 by 100. It is 10%, and now this year he started 6. It is around like that. Gradually, it will be revised on the basis of practical results. My question: what are the criteria, basis of criteria for determining the minimum level, the universal basic income? And second question is, do you think it is substitute or complement to market economy?
Should I take one more? Should I respond?
Why don't we respond to those and we can
Yeah.
give people a chance to.
Yeah, the first question, I think that we've done it. So we've paid it. We've done the Aadhaar identification system. So and it didn't cost that much. Something we easily afford. So it's kind of a moot question. I don't know how much exactly it cost. Maybe 2,000-3,000 crores. Sorry for using crores. You know, when I first went there, I could not think in crores and lakhs, and now I can't think in trillions and billions. So. Sorry, you do the maths. It's a small sum. It's not it's not a big sum. We paid for it. Now, what should be the minimum level? And is it I think it's completely consistent with the market economy. I would in fact say that, especially what I was just saying, if you think that you can actually build a social compact around this, then I think it's exactly not just complementary, but actually a prerequisite for running a market economy. So of that, I have no doubts. Also, if you take something like, supposing everyone could get a certain amount of income, in India, for example, that could actually release your credit constraints. A lot of people don't have collateral to borrow, and if you had a minimum income, that could. So in many ways, it gives you. Actually, this is a point that's worth mentioning. If you read, there's a great paper by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo called "Economic Lives of the Poor," and essentially they end by saying that getting out of poverty is finally a kind of cognitive challenge. If you're in poverty, you just don't have the bandwidth to take the right decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And Senthil Mullainathan has all this kind of, if you give everyone a basic income, I think the kind of liberation of the cognitive bandwidth that happens, I think we kind of, I think people like us can't even imagine, we don't have, the empathy to imagine what a liberating thing that might be. And so in that sense also, I think it's consistent with market economy, but also consistent with all notions of social justice. In terms of the minimum level, every country has to decide that for itself. I mean, we did the calculation, Boban did, as you said, Annie, about 0.45 or 0.5% poverty, because after that, you basically just friction. That costs us. But there are other ways of calculating the number as well. We did an alternative calculation. For example, now in India, we have this panel thing which shows, you may get out of poverty today, but if you face shocks, you lapse back into poverty. So in some ways, you can also think of a number that will actually be sufficient to protect you against possible shocks. So that's another way of calculating the poverty line, but that's going to be very country specific.
Mm-hmm. And so actually, to go back to the first point, since Aadhaar is in place and you mentioned that it was easy enough to pay for that, do you have a sense of the infrastructure cost of implementing UBI, of phasing out the existing subsidies and creating the remainder of the infrastructure that it would take?
See, the phasing out of the existing ones is purely political. There's no kind of money cost to that. I mean, it's a money gain, huge money gain. But I think in terms of the cost of building the infrastructure for transferring UBI, I don't think it's going to be huge. Given that it's a public good. Essentially, the plumbing that we're doing is a public good. Mm-hmm. Aadhaar is a public good. The bank accounts that actually creating the bank accounts did cost money. There's no question about that. The public sector banks, bore the cost of that. And mobile is, I think again, laying the optic fiber network and so on. There's some cost, but I mean the returns to this compared to the investment is just huge.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. So many more questions. Do you want to just go ahead and start picking.
Dev, you choose.
Are you concerned at all about labor market distortions, giving a transfer to everybody? And if you are, what part of that?
Two questions. So you speak about the cognitive bandwidth that's sort of released, when people come out of poverty, and then you would assume that they'd have a lot of free time on their hands. So how do you intend to, what would be policies to absorb them into the labor market as opposed to sort of distortions? When people have more free time, they might want to work. How do you address that? And the other question is related to the institution. So you did talk about some heterogeneity between different states, and that this is sort of a more top-down approach. So do you think there's any gains in efficiency that could be positive spillovers of this? What happens to the middlemen? Do they get gains in efficiency in governance, in the financial sector, and so on? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we take one more? Go ahead. There you go, ma'am.
Thank you. My question goes to the privacy concerns surrounding the Aadhaar number and kind of how are they raised and how are they addressed? What is their nature and how is it addressed? Thank you.
Go ahead, Arvind.
Oh, see, on the labor market distortions, the study that was done in India, the UBI experiment, that showed that there were, no labor market distortions. But then that's again a very small experiment. When you scale up, God knows what happens. So I don't have a good answer to that. See, but that kind of connects a little bit with the second question. Again, this kind of empathy question. When people are at that level of kind of income and subsistence and poverty and consumption, I think the notion that they're not going to do everything they can with the resources they get to kind of move up in life. So my instinct, and it's not terribly scientific reaction, but my instinct is that there is a kind of paternalism and then a kind of elitism in even ask. I'm not, by any means accusing any of you of being elitist. But there is a kind of, intrinsic elitism in asking that question, because people at that level of income, you got to give them all the resources they can, time, money, cognitive bandwidth. So I don't think, I don't worry about that much. On the middleman question, you see, I think that one of the interesting questions is, by definition, you're going to eliminate a lot of these middlemen. So I think that, so there are going to be efficiency gains, and that's not the issue. I think the issue really more is, are there going to be political economy obstructions thrown up by these middlemen, which will impede, and this happened in the cooking gas case, it's happening in the fertilizer subsidy, because there are people who benefit from the leakage and the corruption, and if you're going to kind of eliminate that, there's going to be fierce resistance, and that's happening. So in designing the program, I think these programs, you have to somehow factor into account that response. Because if you say, we just implement and eliminate, there's going to be a backlash. It's going to be very difficult to implement. Now, this question about privacy, it's not about UBI. It's about the biometric identification that underpins that, right? And I recognize I'm in kind of Republican America, having to take this question. So, look, I don't know a whole lot about this, to be honest with you, but I think that ideally, what we would want to do is recognize that there are huge benefits from having this, especially in a poor country like India, to better deliver services. I think that's the starting point. That's what underlay the bill that the government passed last year, to codify the Aadhaar, and there was a lot of legal uncertainty. However, I recognize that that cannot override considerations of privacy, and that we need to balance the two. Where that balance should be and how that's going to be achieved is going to be very much country specific, and I suspect it's going to be an ongoing conversation in India. I don't think we've seen the last of this conversation. I think there are people who have concerns, legitimate concerns about privacy. And I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation. It's going to take, the courts have to, once again, render their verdicts on this. So how that's going to evolve is difficult for me to say. But I think conceptually, I kind of have a sense of where it should end up. But how we're going to get there is kind of an open question.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions here and here and here. Oh. Okay, great. Well, we'll take a few more and then we'll go to these as well.
Ed.
Hi.
How are you, Ed?
Good to see you. I was a little late, so you may have covered this earlier. Is there a hacking issue? And, in other kinds of systems, there's a lot of potential for corruption, but in automated systems there obviously are as well. Secondly, did you, you talked about one of the objections to the system might be that there's other systems in place and getting rid of them is hard. What are you doing about that? Are you giving people a ratcheted downward getting rid of it, or are you just cutting them off?
Ed, on the first one, I mean, there are always hacking issues, so it's unavoidable. So the question is, do we have sufficient safeguards against hacking? You can never get a perfect system, but in India, I think that there have been some issues on hacking, but I'm not the expert. I just defer to Nandan, who actually implemented this. He said recently that it's a pretty secure system as these systems go. So whether it's perfect, whether it's going to prevent hacking, I just don't know. But I think the bigger concern in India, I think at the moment at least, is less hacking and more privacy. I think that's where we are in the conversation. On what is actually happening on the phasing down, remember, we've not started implementing this as yet, so that, I think, question will arise. But in those states that are considering this, yes, they are thinking of switching from some existing program and diverting the resource to that. So in that sense, they are going to de facto contemplate some phasing down of existing programs.
Great. So let's take a few more questions from the audience. I think there's up in the front row here and one from right behind.
Thanks very much. Hi, Mohini Malhotra. Thanks for this. Under the UBI, does everybody get the same amount of transfer? And how does one politically sell the message that somebody like you or anybody in this room would get the same amount as a poor person?
Yeah.
Albeit with your arguments on targeting and what's been wrong with targeting. And the second question is this coming to pass? Does it have multi-party support? And what's the time frame that you envision this happening?
And if you could just pass the microphone backwards. Thanks. We'll take one more.
Hi. Well, thank you for the very interesting discussion
and
here.
if everybody, I apologize, if everybody could introduce themselves, I'm sorry.
I'm taking from the perspective that you put out on understanding the cognitive constraint that the poor face. Well, if you give security as a basic income, you also provide some kind of one-way commodity for the market. What my concern is, and I think you framed it in the very beginning, is that there's a discussion that's very different from UBI in Europe or in other circumstances where you do have in place health and education and support for the poor, and in UBI in India itself, where you only giving them money, you give them access to the market, but a very limited access to necessary goods. So I want to know exactly how is the plan of cutting down those government interventions, and what are the projects of actually expanding health and education in India?
Yep, sure, yep. So the first question, I think it's actually a very good question and something that we discussed. See, I think that the virtue of universality is that it gets over the targeting problems that have bedeviled all these programs all over the world. So conceptually, that's the plus. But even conceptually, at least politically, doing universal just will not fly. So the way I like to discuss it, and that's the way I'd like to formulate it, is say, de jure universal, but de facto quasi-universal. And there are many ways one can make it quasi-universal. So think of it this way: in a targeting approach, you say who's in. In this other approach, you say who's out. And so that's the way to, I think about how it can actually happen, that you say everyone gets it except those who have cars, those who have air conditioners, and then your biometrics and all of that information helps you target those people out. So that's the way I think this will realistically proceed going forward. It's never going to be universal, I think for good reason. Now, will it come to pass? Is there multi-party support? Look, I do think that the idea has kind of gaining traction. After we did the economic survey, when we discussed this, and people should correct me. I might be misreading it out of being self-serving here, but there was a lot of discussion of this, and I've interacted with a lot of people. There is a lot of interest in this. I mean, but that doesn't mean that there's political acceptance and people are willing to implement it. But the notion that with one stroke you can actually eliminate poverty, that's kind of the tantalizing prospect that UBI creates, I think is something that people are discussing and thinking about very seriously. So in that sense, it is a exciting idea which I think is gaining traction in India. Whether it's going to be implemented, I don't know. I think there will be hopefully some experiments soon. Now, if I understood your question correctly, I think that's precisely the fear. I think there is no intention for UBI to replace government provision of public goods like health, education, infrastructure, et cetera. I think the two, what it is or it should replace in order to make it fiscally viable, is that it replaces similar kind of welfare programs like subsidies and other kind of employment guarantee schemes, etc. I mean, one has to keep that absolutely clear that this is, it is like not with public goods like health and education, but it's like with other anti-poverty welfare programs, and that's what's going to be phased out or needs to be phased out in order to make this manageable.
Mm-hmm. And so to actually follow up on the first point, if you are moving towards a system where there's de jure universality but de facto non-universality, does that create an opportunity for graft, right? Like if you have the resources to have an air conditioner in a car, perhaps you're going to figure out how to keep those payments. And second of all, would it be problematic if it actually just were universal given the shape of the income distribution in India? How many people do you need to exempt from it? What proportion of the population?
Right. So that's, I think, I think politically, this going to the top 5, 10, 15% is going to be very difficult to set. Right. I think so we have to recognize that. And I think that, getting people to opt out, remember, there are possibilities. One way is to say, you can target out, and because government has, elaborate baseline data on people who have cars, people who have big bank accounts with big balances. Mm-hmm. So I think that's you just say you only give it to this and don't give it to them. So it's the other way to do it. Kind of drawing inspiration from behavioral economics is to say give it up kind of things. So because remember in India we had along with when we transferred the cooking gas subsidy into a direct transfer. We also simultaneously started this program where there was a voluntary, give up your subsidy program. I mean, it actually did much better than I expected. Again, Neeraj is the expert here. Something like 10 to 12 million people have given it up under the scheme. So it's conceivable that you could do something similar for UBI. You say, if you're rich, please give it up, and you can do name and shame and that sort of stuff. So targeting out, I think, is less problematic than kind of targeting in.
Great. So let's go ahead and just take one more quick round of questions. Go to the front over on this side. Go ahead, ma'am. Get some from the first row.
Hi, Anjali Kumar, World Bank. What's attractive about what you describe is that it appears to be a sort of a revenue neutral way of financing this amazing new outreach to the poor. And my first question here is, to what extent are you really in a position to measure what you can give up of all the current subsidies? You talk about this myriad array of current subsidies. There's a gas subsidy which is more efficient than the kerosene subsidy, which is less efficient than the food subsidy, and so on. Have you actually been able to accurately measure what the level, not the level, but how efficient each of these are, and how much of them you would have to give up? In other words, how close are you towards implementation? Then the flip side of it is the service delivery thing. So one is a question of how you finance, the other is the question of how you send it out. And on the service delivery side, we've talked a great deal already about, the last mile and so on. But I want to know whether there's been any study about the fidelity of the Aadhaar card itself. And I've been worried by certain types of information in India which suggests to me that although you've snapped the cornea or the eye or whatever well enough, the ancillary information that's being fed in on your address or where you come from and so on is not actually as faithful to reality as we would like. And a lot of it is a little bit garbage in and garbage out. And I don't know whether there's been a reality check on this system in which we're placing such a huge amount of confidence to do this kind of service delivery.
Great. Okay. Did you want to just pass it down your row?
Martin.
Thanks, Arvind. Martin Rama, World Bank. Thanks for the stimulating talk. I would like to push a bit on the behavioral part. One side of the comment, more the kind of comment you will get from the right, one the comment you will get from the left. And more of the right side comment is the incentives. If you have, when you have a threshold, of course, a narrow-minded economist will think you will not work or save if you are slightly below the threshold, and you have a third of the population who may be, or a fourth maybe. So the disincentive of effort and saving. You say, well, it may be liberating based on what we know, but I remember there was that article by Assar Lindbeck long ago about the political economy of the New Left, saying it was a great thing for the generation that had grown in working hard, and it became an entitlement a generation later. So that will be one of the concerns. On the other side, on the replacing the existing programs, more of the left argument would be, we have been doing conditional cash transfers that work for taking kids to school, vaccination, meals that go beyond the income dimension. Will there be a loss in replacing those?
Right. Then I'm just going to add two comments, one from Twitter and one from the live stream. So this is from Brajesh Upadhyay from BBC News. And he asks, is there evidence that demonetization has clamped down on corruption? Perhaps yet. And from the live stream, this is Felipe Mentega. Will political leaders see UBI as a mechanism to disempower the states in favor of Delhi?
Okay. Good questions. Let me start with Anjali's question here on revenue neutrality and the financing and the fidelity. You see, one of the things that so far, we've been saying, look, this costs so much, it's only affordable if you get rid of this. But there is another possibility in India. There is the possibility that, look, if demonetization works, if tax compliance goes up, if the GST becomes a buoyant source of revenue, then actually you have some more revenues to finance UBI. So it's not necessarily a zero-sum game in that sense. And so the whole how the tax buoyancy is going to evolve over time. And I'm very excited about the GST becoming, inducing more compliance, precisely because of technology and the infrastructure that's going to back it up. So it doesn't have to be, zero sum and, dependent entirely, at least over a medium term, over a 5 to 7 year horizon, you could think of tax revenues going up and so on. Now, second question, have you calculated, which are the ones, the effectiveness different? And actually we have. If you read the economic survey, again, Boban here along with colleagues, we have, 5, 6 of the major programs. We calculate what the targeting efficiency of this for each of these programs, right? And so, but in a sense, remember that that's not what's going to drive the decision on what's going to be phased out. It's going to be based on a political decision of, is it easier to phase out the food subsidy than the kerosene subsidy, than the fertilizer subsidy? Is the farmer lobby more important than the consumer lobby? I think that's going to drive it. But we do have the calculations there on which, my preferred, the first one to take out is the fertilizer subsidy. I think the fertilizer subsidy is just, there is just nothing good about that, and it's a lot of money. It's almost 1% of GDP. So that would be my number one candidate for phase out. Now, the fidelity of Aadhaar, again, maybe we should have had Nandan here. I think in the last 2 weeks or so, I have also heard reports of things not being as the authentication is not as, or the authentication rate is not as high as it should be. Because remember, this was touted as initially you get a failure rate of less than even 0.5%. I haven't looked at the evidence carefully that's coming out. They say that in some parts, the failure rates are much higher, and I think we really need to. So it's possible that we may have to reassess that, and I think then it would be a matter of just getting the technology right and investing more in the technology. I don't think at this stage any of this suggests that we should kind of abandon the scheme or anything like that. Martin's questions on the whole attack from the right, Martin. At one level, I'll be honest with you, I don't care about savings. I mean, this is an anti-poverty program. If all of it goes towards increased consumption, I mean, I'm fine with that. Whatever savings and things you get is all a bonus. And I do think that all of us should imagine, empathize that we're scrambling for our next meal. That's the situation that we have to put ourselves in. So I to me the bar is if it increases, all of it goes on consumption. Of course, I think there are issues about if you transfer the money, is the man appropriating it and not giving it to the woman, family, all those issues. Those are real issues. But effort and savings, I don't worry about at this stage. Now, will it replace conditional cash transfers? See, in India, remember that we don't have many of those conditional cash transfers like Mexico and so on. I mean, we do have. You could say that some of the ICDS, some of them are kind of quasi-conditional, but I think it's a broader issue of what are the programs that you can legitimately phase out, whether they're conditional, whether they are just subsidies or whatever. I don't think the conditional part of it is I think especially important in India. Demonetization and corruption. I think that again. It really is something that's, when you think about corruption, corruption is something, it's so difficult to measure, and also it's something that you kind of assess over a kind of sweep of 10, 15, 20 years. So to say that, to even expect that today you do something and tomorrow corruption, whatever that is, and however you measure it comes down, is not, I think, a question that's, it's, if I may say so, well posed, even the question. I think it's a thing. Now, is UBI a way for Delhi to appropriate power at the expense of the states? I don't think that's true at all. If anything, I think the interest is coming a lot from the states themselves to want to do this. So I don't think this is at all a kind of imposition by Delhi in any way at all.
So I'd like to thank Arvind for taking the time, all of you, the Center for Global Development, for hosting this event. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Rajesh, I think, has a few more words.
And let me just add a special welcome, a special thank you, in fact, to Annie Lowry as well for doing such a great job moderating. Annie, thank you very much indeed. Panelists, if you'd like to exit. While our panelists leave the stage, I'm just going to give you a few more details about all the other things that are going on here at the centre this week in the hope that you might make some time in your busy calendars and come and join us. So tomorrow morning, the President of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, will be here to discuss his ideas for the future role, the future comparative advantage of his institution. In the afternoon, we'll be launching the first of 2 reports that we are launching this week. This one will be looking at how to do better for refugees, some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And for that, we'll be joined by David Miliband, Kristalina Georgieva, and Jordan's Minister for Planning, Imad Fakhoury. On Thursday, 2 back-to-back events bring us discussions on education, how to make global education better, how to actually achieve learning outcomes, as well as just scale up the extent of enrollment. And for that, we have Gordon Brown, we have Julia Gillard, both former Prime Ministers, we have His Excellency Kikwete, former President of Tanzania, and we also have Anthony Lake, the Executive Director of UNICEF. So if you're around, please come to that event. And straight after that, the last of our report launches this week, Payout for Perils, which is our report looking at how insurance can be used to radically improve how we respond in the wake of disasters. DFID's Chief Economist, Stefan Durkon, and our own Owen Barder will be here for that. So there's quite a lot going on. We'd love to see you here again this week. But for now, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you.